Hi everyone, Karen Alari here. In this video I'll be showing you some of the techniques I use in painting the landscape in acrylics, especially creating texture and interest with layering. We're starting today with a little sky, and I'm showing you how I use layering and to create clouds. I'm using a small round bristle brush, and I lay in the paint over a base. You would always start your painting by doing a block in, as I've showed you in quite a few of my other videos. So in this one I just want to show you specifically how I use those layering techniques. So I laid in some paint using this bristle brush on its side in a kind of a scrubbing motion. And then what you do is you rinse out your brush thoroughly and pat it dry on your paper towel, and then come back in and blend out some of those bottom edges to keep your sky smooth and soft. I wanted to add a little warmth to this cloud, so I brought in a little bit of a peachy color and then came right back in with a lighter white, slightly blue cloud color, and then I can come back and blend those two together again. This effect of layering is a great way to make skies and background trees and fields. You can use it in all elements of your landscape painting. Just real quickly showing you some of these background areas that I'm putting in. This is a technique for making a field, again using that bristle brush, laying it on its side, and lightly brushing it back and forth across the painting. What happens as you build up these layers is that you create texture on the canvas itself, and as long as you keep the brush very loose in your hand, you're holding it very lightly and just skimming that paint along the surface that you've already built up. And the more layers you put in, the more textured and skimmy, and it picks up in some areas and doesn't in others. And then you go back right away. With acrylics, you always have to do your blending right away. You can't wait down the road. You have to lay down some paint, rinse your brush, dry it a little on a paper towel, and then come back with that scrubbing motion to blend those layers back together and to blend them into the canvas. You know, always when you're working with a landscape, the areas in the background are softer and smoother, and as you come forward, you're going to leave more and more texture and create more and more texture, just to create that sense of distance. But the techniques are the same. It's just as you're working in the background, you're blending more and you're keeping things softer. And as I come to the foreground, like I'm doing here, I'm creating more of the grassy, dried grass area, and so I'm keeping those brush strokes a little more distinct. You could see that I laid down a dark, came back with a lighter color, I'm coming back with a dark again, and now I'm taking that lighter brown color and blending it back down into the dark I've made, all using the same brush stroke with my small round bristle brush on its side in these sort of loose scrubbing motions, and blending together as I go, as I need to. I'm still using my bristle brush here, but you can see my technique has changed. I'm putting in a tree trunk, and I use it with a lot of paint, laying it down on the canvas and pulling it upwards. Then moving to starting to create these layer after layer in this foreground tree. And that's really the beauty of acrylics, is you can do these layer after layer after layer, both to get the effect that you want, to get your brush strokes right, and just to create that texture and that interest and that activity that's going on. Now I'm using a liner brush. It's a very thin, long brush, and when you use a liner brush, you're going to thin your paint down a little more, almost to an inky consistency, but load a lot of it on your brush. And just as I did using the bristle brush, I'm using a pulling motion with this liner brush to create these little twigs and branches. So you want to use a pulling motion that stops and starts to get those realistic looking, natural looking branches. And then you can come back using that same brush to add a little highlight to your trunk. I use this technique a lot in creating just messy little weedy areas, holding the brush very loosely between my fingers and flicking it. There I'm using it on its side, and then I use the end of it and just flick it very randomly to create a little bit of a sense of a little bit of grasses and things poking out. And then you can come back in with the bristle brush, blending some of those out, blending the edge back down to make it feel soft and natural. And some of those hard edges will stay and some of them will be softened out. Back to the main technique of making foliage with acrylic paints in my method, this round bristle brush that's old, it's kind of splayed out, it's not perfectly pointed, and in fact I kind of pounded the end down into the paint as I'm going to keep it splayed out. And then I roll it along, starting with your dark tones of your tree and then moving into lighter tones. And with each time I go back to load up more paint on my brush, I'm going to be changing the color a little bit, adding some yellow, adding some green, adding some different shades to make every layer different and create that interest in that texture. As you can see, I'm still keeping it on the side. There's a combination of sort of a rolling motion with the brush, keeping it very light, and then as you build up those layers, you can see the rolling real clearly. There's rolling and patting, and then coming back in immediately to soften back up some of the edges. I like to leave those top edges often. They have a very leafy kind of a look to them without being distinct separate leaves. And you can do this layering technique with acrylics because the layers are dry underneath already. If you try to do this with some other mediums, they would muddy up and blend together, and you would lose those distinct layers that are being created one on top of the other. Continuing to go from dark to light, and as you get more and more layers on the canvas, your touch gets lighter and lighter, and the underneath layers just pick up tiny bits of the paint here and there, the lighter your touch is. That's really the key. Practice this on some watercolor paper, practice it on the side a little bit. The key is really getting that soft touch. And this is the blending part of it, where I rinse my brush, put a little water on it, and I can blend out some of those bottom areas, even using my damp paper towel to wipe back some of the areas I want. And the key is you're leaving some of those edges at the top, but then softening some of the lower edges or the interior edges, however it makes sense for you. As I get to the edges of the tree itself, you can see how light my touch becomes in just little flicks. You lay that brush on the canvas on its side, start that rolling motion, and flick it upwards as you pull away so that you just get little feathery edges going onto the tree. And as you do it, it's great in acrylics because you can keep going back from dark to light to dark to light and building up those layers of the back of the tree, the middle of the tree. You noticed we started with some kind of dull background colors first, put in some trunk and some branches, and then put in the leaves that are on the front of the tree. And now I'm coming back in to reestablish those darks. I knew where that dark trunk was, and I know I need that high contrast in this focal area of my painting. So I've got to come back and reestablish those darks, and then I'll come back in as well, both with my bristle brush and now with that liner brush to reestablish those twigs and branches that are going on in the interior of the tree there. Use this same liner brush to add more twigs to the shadowed area under the tree. So these techniques of going back and forth with the bristle brush to add foliage, the liner brush to add twigs, using dark paint for the twigs, and then coming back in with some light paint to also do the highlighted sides of those brushes, of those branches, remembering what direction your light is coming from all the time. Use that same brush, adding more into the shadow area as well, and coming back and adding some of those light highlighted sides of the branches. This is a great brush. It's very flexible. You can use it as I am now with flicking, rhythmic motions and little dabbing, tapping motions to get little dots and little lines. And you don't have to draw in every twig and every weed that's along the way, but if you just get this sense of freedom of movement is really important, and that liner brush can help you do that because you keep your hand free, you hold it very loosely in your hand, and you just keep this loose flicking motion going. This whole front area is again the technique of making loose grasses, dried grasses, wildflower areas that you see in a lot of your foregrounds in landscape painting. And again, using my brush on the side, I often pick up the canvas itself so that I can get those wide sweeping movements across the whole canvas and getting those sideways movements as opposed to the up and down ones. Again, it's all about not picking out a particular plant and painting it or drawing it, but just getting these loose layers of texture that give the impression of grasses and weeds and whatnot. Starting with some darker greens and then coming back in with some lighter greens. And if you don't mix your paint entirely on the canvas in doing this, it works really well. If you have some dark and some light on your brush itself, then you can create even more texture and interest. What I'm laying down here with that same motion, that rolling side of the brush motion, is the basis for some yellow weedy wildflowers that are out there. So you always start with your dark colors first, your shadow colors, and I'm laying down this sort of a dark yellowish brown color as the shadow color for these golden yellow wildflowers. Coming back in with the mid-tone, again you can see I'm using that bristle brush and just rolling it along the top, leaving some of that bottom area of the shadow visible, and rolling that brush. And then you're going to come back, rinse, and blend a little bit where you need it to be blended. Even lighter yellow, again, as you get more and more paint on the canvas, your touch gets lighter and lighter, but be sure to keep a lot of paint on the brush itself, but just hold it very lightly and loosely in your hand and just skim it across the surface. If you use too much pressure and press down, you'll just have a big glob and you'll cover up all of your layers below. But if you keep your hand loose and just barely touch the surface, I'm doing it again with some blue, so the sky color is going to come down and have an influence on what's on the ground, so you're going to see those little bits of blue shadowy sky reflections in the foreground itself. So this is again another layer of paint and another level of going with an even lighter touch, just barely skimming. The flat surfaces of the ground are going to show even more of that sky reflection on them, so you'll get more of a brushing sideways area where there's flat ground and not weeds and whatnot. Same thing with the tree. There will be you'll see little tiny bits of the blue sky reflecting on the leaves. So I come in with that blue sky color with a very, very, very light touch, just barely touching it. So those are really the main techniques that I use with the bristle brush and the liner brush. The rolling, the sideways sweeps for fields, and watching those edges, coming back in right away and blending them out where I need to, but leaving some of those edges. And you can see as it dries, you'll reevaluate and decide if it's too dark or too light, and you can come back in with, I came back in with some brighter, more vivid colors, and you can just layer those right over the top, and it just adds that one more layer of depth and interest. So those are really the techniques that I wanted to show you today, is this little bit of using an old bristle brush. It's not a special brush. It wasn't a very expensive brush to begin with, and I've literally been using this brush for years. And the last technique that you use with making a tree like this is to come back in with, we call them sky holes, or if the pond was behind that, it's actually a pond hole. But here I'm using a very small soft brush. It's a round brush, and I just use that to add in some of the background colors back into the sky, to give into the tree, to give it a more airy feel. That's it for our technique video. Thanks for joining me.